For most of Britain, David Coleman was a voice. For Barbara, he was everything else. She witnessed the man behind the microphone, the husband, the father, the private figure few people ever truly knew. Yet as the years passed, she also witnessed something far more painful: the slow disappearance of one of Britain's greatest sporting voices. Because David Coleman's ending was never supposed to look like this. Not after the World Cups, not after the FA Cup finals, not after Grandstand, Sports Night, and almost half a century at the heart of British sport. For decades, millions listened whenever David Coleman spoke. His voice became part of football's golden age, part of Saturday afternoons, part of family living rooms, part of sporting history itself. Then the world changed. Television changed, sport changed, and slowly, the voice that once seemed impossible to replace began fading from public view. One of the most recognizable men in British broadcasting was living a life of near silence. The strange thing is that David Coleman was never truly forgotten by the people who grew up with him. Fans still remembered. Broadcasters still respected him. Athletes still praised him. Yet somehow the man himself seemed to disappear with the era he helped create. And perhaps nobody understood that better than Barbara, the woman who stood beside him long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the crowds stopped listening, and long after football's golden age had begun to fade away. So what really happened to David Coleman? Why did one of Britain's greatest sporting voices end his life so far from the spotlight he once commanded? And what does Barbara's silence reveal about the final chapter of a man millions thought they knew? Subscribe as we uncover the silence that followed David Coleman. The strange thing about David Coleman was that millions knew his voice, but very few knew the man. He never chased celebrity. He rarely spoke about himself. And even at the height of his fame, he remained intensely private. That would never change, because behind the confidence people heard on television was a man built on discipline, preparation, standards, and a determination to get things right. Long before the BBC made him famous, those qualities were already shaping his life. Coleman loved competition, respected hard work, and expected excellence, not only from himself, but from everyone around him. Some admired him for it, others found him difficult, but nobody doubted his commitment. He was not trying to be popular, he was trying to be the best. That attitude followed him wherever he went, whether he was working as a journalist, covering sport, or preparing for a broadcast. Coleman believed details mattered, accuracy mattered, professionalism mattered. It was an old-fashioned way of thinking, but it helped separate him from many of his contemporaries. As his reputation grew, so did the opportunities. The young journalist was beginning to attract attention, and before long, a new chapter appeared, one that would change his life forever. Because David Coleman was about to enter a world that would make him famous across Britain, the BBC. And once he arrived, British sport would never sound the same again. When David Coleman arrived at the BBC, few could have predicted what would happen next. British television was changing, sport was becoming bigger, audiences were growing, and the BBC needed people who could handle pressure. Coleman proved he could. Very quickly, he brought something different to broadcasting: authority, speed, and an ability to make complicated moments sound simple. Viewers trusted him, not because he demanded it, but because he sounded prepared. As the years passed, his role continued to grow. Football became one of the biggest parts of that journey. FA Cup finals, league football, international matches, World Cups. David Coleman was suddenly at the center of some of the sport's biggest occasions. For many supporters, his voice became part of the match itself, and there was something else that made him special: his memory, his preparation, his knowledge. Before mobile phones, before live apps, before instant statistics, Coleman could explain what a result meant almost immediately. League positions, title races, relegation battles, records, form. Everything seemed to be stored somewhere inside his head. That ability made him invaluable, especially during football's famous Saturday afternoons. As results arrived from grounds around the country, Coleman could instantly tell viewers why they mattered. For millions of supporters, he became part of the weekly ritual, a familiar voice connecting one result to another, one stadium to the next, one generation to the next. By the 1970s, David Coleman was everywhere, not in the way modern celebrities are everywhere, but in a way that felt far more permanent. Football supporters heard him. Olympic fans heard him. Families gathered around their televisions and heard him. Week after week, year after year. Programs like Grandstand became part of British life. For many households, Saturday afternoons followed a familiar routine: football, results, sport, and somewhere in the middle of it all was David Coleman. His voice became associated with some of the biggest sporting moments of the era. Moments of joy, moments of heartbreak, moments that millions still remember today. What made Coleman different was his ability to make an event feel important, even before the drama arrived. He understood timing, he understood tension, and he understood when to let a moment speak for itself. As television sport grew larger, so did his reputation. The BBC trusted him with its biggest broadcasts, and audiences trusted him to guide them through them. For many viewers, David Coleman became the sound of Britain's sporting golden age, an age before endless channels, before social media, before sport became available every second of every day. It was a different world, and Coleman stood at the center of it. Looking back now, that era feels almost impossible to recreate. The voices changed, the programs changed, the way people consumed sport changed. But for those who lived through it, one thing remained constant: David Coleman was there. And that is why so many people still remember him. Not simply because he commentated on history, but because he became part of it. The public heard confidence. The people who worked with David Coleman often saw something else: a perfectionist, a competitor, a man who demanded high standards. Coleman expected preparation, accuracy, professionalism, and he had little patience for those who failed to meet those standards. That reputation followed him throughout his career. Some colleagues admired it, others found him intimidating, but almost everyone respected him, because behind the demanding exterior was someone who cared deeply about getting things right. He took sport seriously, he took broadcasting seriously, and he believed audiences deserved the very best. That attitude helped make him one of the BBC's most trusted figures, but it could also create friction. Coleman was never the easiest man in the room. He could be blunt, direct, and fiercely competitive, especially when it came to rival broadcasters. Yet many of the people who knew him best painted a more balanced picture. Former athletes spoke about his generosity, his advice, his willingness to help younger broadcasters and sportsmen navigate major events. They saw a side of Coleman the public rarely witnessed, a man who could be demanding and supportive at exactly the same time. That contradiction made him fascinating. The voice sounded calm. The man behind it was driven. The broadcaster appeared effortless. The preparation behind the scenes was anything but. And perhaps that was the secret of David Coleman. The standards that made him difficult were often the same standards that made him great. But even great broadcasters make mistakes. And before long, some of David Coleman's most famous moments would have nothing to do with football at all. For all his success, David Coleman was not universally loved. In fact, some of the biggest controversies of his career came from moments when his determination to get the story went too far. One incident followed him for years: the 1968 Challenge Cup final. Don Fox had just missed one of the most famous kicks in rugby league history. He was devastated. The match was lost. The pressure was overwhelming. Yet moments later, Coleman was interviewing him. Many viewers felt the questioning was too harsh, too soon, too focused on the story rather than the man standing in front of him. It became one of the most debated moments of his broadcasting career, and it reinforced a criticism that would follow him for years. David Coleman could sometimes be relentless. He wanted answers, even when emotions were still raw. Then there were the famous Coleman balls, the accidental phrases, the verbal mistakes, the moments that Private Eye magazine would later collect and publish. Before long, people across Britain were repeating them. Some found them hilarious. Coleman often found them frustrating, because many of the mistakes happened during live broadcasts. No scripts, no retakes, no second chances, just one voice speaking to millions. Yet the strange thing was that the jokes never damaged his reputation. If anything, they made him more human. Behind the authority, behind the confidence, behind the famous voice, there was somebody capable of making mistakes like everyone else. And while critics occasionally targeted him, many of his colleagues defended him. They knew how difficult live broadcasting really was. They knew the pressure, the preparation, the responsibility, because for every mistake people remembered, there were thousands of broadcasts where David Coleman got everything exactly right. That was why the respect never disappeared. The criticisms remained. The jokes survived, but so did the admiration. And soon, David Coleman would face a challenge far greater than an awkward interview or a broadcasting mistake. A moment when sport itself stopped being the main story. For most of his career, David Coleman was there to describe sporting drama, victories, defeats, records, history. But in 1972, he faced something very different. Something no sports broadcaster ever wants to cover: the Munich Olympic hostage crisis. What began as a celebration of sport quickly became an international tragedy. Suddenly, the focus was no longer on medals or competition. Lives were at risk. The entire world was watching, and David Coleman found himself at the center of one of the most difficult broadcasting situations imaginable. There was confusion, rumors, conflicting information, fear. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next. Yet throughout those dark hours, Coleman remained calm, measured, professional. Years later, many broadcasters and journalists would point to Munich as one of the finest examples of his career. Not because of excitement, not because of commentary, but because of judgment. For once, the famous voice of sport had to become something else. A journalist, a communicator, a steady presence during a moment of genuine horror. It revealed a side of David Coleman many viewers rarely saw. The man behind the broadcaster. The trained journalist who understood that some events were bigger than sport. Much bigger. The experience left a lasting mark on him, and it reminded audiences why the BBC trusted him with its biggest moments. Because when pressure reached its highest level, Coleman rarely lost control. He understood responsibility, he understood timing, and he understood when words mattered most. Ironically, one of the greatest moments of David Coleman's career had very little to do with sport at all. But while his professional reputation remained immense, the years ahead would bring changes he could not control. Television was changing, broadcasting was changing, and slowly, the sporting world that had made David Coleman famous was beginning to change with it. While millions knew David Coleman as a broadcaster, very few knew much about his life away from television. That was exactly how he wanted it. Unlike many famous figures of his era, Coleman rarely invited the public into his private world. He did not chase headlines. He did not build a celebrity image, and he rarely spoke about family matters. At the center of that private world was his wife, Barbara. The two were together for decades, long before the fame, long before the World Cups, long before David Coleman became a household name. Together, they built a family and raised 6 children. Yet despite his public profile, Coleman worked hard to keep that part of his life separate from broadcasting. Many viewers knew almost everything about the matches he covered, but knew almost nothing about the man who covered them. That was no accident. Privacy mattered to him, perhaps more than most people realized. Even as his career grew, he remained far more comfortable discussing sport than discussing himself. Those closest to him often described a very different figure from the one seen on television. Away from the microphone, there was no audience to impress, no program to present, no result to analyze, just a husband, a father, and a man who valued home far more than public attention. In many ways, Barbara witnessed the side of David Coleman the public never saw. The frustrations, the pressures, the demands of a career spent constantly under scrutiny. She saw the man behind the voice, the man behind the reputation, the man behind the image. And as the years passed, she also witnessed something else, the slow end of an era, because the broadcasting world that David Coleman had helped build was beginning to move on. New faces arrived, new styles appeared, new generations took over, and for the first time in his career, David Coleman was no longer standing at the center of it all. The final chapter was approaching, and it would prove far more painful than many people realized. By the end of the 1990s, the world David Coleman had helped build was changing. Television was changing, broadcasting was changing, and for the first time in decades, Coleman was no longer at the center of it. For a man built on competition and excellence, it was never going to be easy. Perhaps the most painful part was how quietly it happened. After almost half a century at the BBC, many believed he deserved a farewell worthy of his contribution. Instead, reports later described him as feeling unwanted and unhappy as his broadcasting career came to an end. For many supporters, that felt deeply unfair. This was the voice of World Cups, FA Cup finals, Grandstand, and some of Britain's greatest sporting moments. Yet the goodbye never matched the achievement. Perhaps nobody understood that disappointment better than Barbara. After everything David Coleman had given to sport, many believed he deserved far better. Even many of his rivals agreed. Few broadcasting rivalries were more famous than the one between David Coleman and ITV's Brian Moore. The two men spent years competing for audiences, yet even Moore respected Coleman's extraordinary ability. When news of Coleman's death broke in December 2013, tributes arrived from across British sport. Gary Lineker described him as a giant of sports broadcasting. Brendan Foster called him one of the greatest sports broadcasters Britain had ever produced. Suddenly,
British moment, and such a great British moment that David Coleman's commentary was just outstanding.
People were reminded of how much he had meant, not only to football, but to a generation that grew up with Grandstand and the classified football results. Perhaps that was the real tragedy, not that football moved on, but that one of its most famous voices never received the farewell his career deserved. David Coleman did not simply commentate on football's golden age, he became part of it. And when that voice finally fell silent, a piece of football's golden age disappeared with it. Subscribe as we remember David Coleman, the voice behind football's golden age.